Making games hard. It's something that I think gamers should do from time to time in order to get an amazing experience out of a particular game. There are two ends of the spectrum when it comes to difficulty. There's the easiest difficulty, which can look something like this. And then there's the hardest difficulty, which can look something like this. Now, in my opinion, this is a very nuanced topic. And what I mean by that is some games are supposed to be chill games, and there's nothing wrong with that. Other games want to be taken very seriously, and also there's nothing wrong with that either. Where the nuance comes into play is when you start talking about those games that are in between the two ends of the spectrum. In my opinion, the games that are in between both extremes can benefit greatly when difficulty is increased. Now, before we get further into this topic, we should establish what difficulty is. Difficulty is the state or condition of being difficult. So, if we were to use this definition of difficulty, and if we were to use what we know about video games, then it's safe to assume that there are many ways to increase difficulty in a video game. The most common one would be to raise the skill on the enemy AI. At first, this would seem like the logical thing to do, but once again, it's a bit more complicated than doing just this one thing. In some games, when you raise the difficulty, it raises the skill level of the enemy AI, obviously, but it will also raise the damage that the AI does to the player, which, depending on the context, can be another good or bad thing. But the real problem here comes with the added health that the enemies receive. You see, for example, in Bethesda's games, when you up the difficulty, the player takes significantly more damage from enemy attacks, while those same enemies are able to tank a lot more damage. In my opinion, this breaks the game and takes me out of having a great experience with the game because combat now becomes something that just isn't really enjoyable. Maybe I'm the only one that doesn't enjoy putting 14 arrows in someone's forehead for them just to finally die on the 15th, but I don't think I'm alone. Another game that suffers from the same problem is BioShock. A couple years ago, I played through the BioShock series, and when I booted up the first game, I wasn't really thinking, and I made the mistake of putting the game on the hardest difficulty. I quickly realized when I came across my first basic human enemy, I had to pummel this person with a wrench what felt like 50 times while they could hit me with the same weapon a handful of times and I would die. I thought to myself that maybe I could shoot my way out of this problem and learned that this was not the case either. I ended up somehow beating the first game on the hardest difficulty and finished the rest of the series on standard difficulties, which felt much better. That being said, to anyone out there that hasn't played these titles, I can't recommend them enough. Now, before we move on, let's recap. Our goal is to make games harder, which will give us a better overall experience. We've established what difficulty means, and we know that raising the difficulty outright can sour the experience for the player. So what else can we do if we're wanting to raise the difficulty and give us a great experience for whatever game we're playing? Well, the first thing that we can mess around with is the HUD. To anyone who isn't aware of a game called Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, it's an open-world stealth action game. While the game will give you a one-of-a-kind experience, there are things that could be tweaked on the player's side that would make the experience better and even more memorable. For example, the marking system. The marking system in this game makes it significantly easier. Pulling out your binoculars and simply looking at an enemy for a few seconds will put a marker over their head and allow you to track them through walls. Eliminating the markers for enemies in this game will drastically slow the player down. The player will have to make a conscious effort to remember how many guards they've spotted, where the guards patrol, and the player will have to pay closer attention to audio cues such as footsteps as well as dialogue between the enemy soldiers rather than keeping an eye out for the glowing red marker above everyone's head. This can change the way you play the game completely. It will make the player be more deliberate of how, when, and where you move. Another example of a game that can greatly benefit from having limited to no HUD is the Hitman trilogy. Much like what we just talked about, this game is a stealth action game. It too can suffer from when the player knows exactly where enemies are via a minimap, as well as an ability to see through walls. I played through this trilogy last year and I turned off all the enemy markers and actually unbound the ability to see through walls. This made the game significantly harder when playing because I could no longer see how many guards were in areas of the map that I wasn't allowed access to. I wasn't able to see that there was a guard patrolling the hallways and was about to come across the chef that I just choked out and left in the corner, or the person that's about to walk in on me as I drown my poor victim in the toilet. Once again, I had to be deliberate with my actions. I had to count the guards in an area and had to make sure that I knew where the guards would patrol and how often. I had to actually take time to think what the best course of action would be in order to complete the mission. The Sniper Elite games are another good example of how eliminating the HUD can give you a drastically different experience. But the thing is, this game's difficulty setting is tied to the HUD. You can go into custom settings and tweak it as you see fit. So you can play on the hardest difficulty while keeping the HUD on. You can also play on the easiest difficulty and have the HUD turned off, or anything in between. The developers knew that the less HUD that you have, the more authentic the experience would become for the player, and I believe that they're 100% right. It is up to the player just how much HUD you have in video games, and that's what's great about it. You get to tailor your own experience. There is no 100% correct answer. These are just a few examples of games that can give you an even better experience when you decide to give yourself a more difficult time by tweaking the HUD. The second thing that we can change is fast travel. Now, I don't believe fast travel is bad. In fact, I think it's actually great when it's utilized correctly. If the player discovers a location in a game and is given a quest to travel back to a town that they had previously been before, you could argue either way on whether or not you should fast travel to complete this quest. On one side of the argument, someone could make the case that you've already discovered the area and it's just a matter of convenience to get the quest done because maybe they want this particular reward for completing the quest and it's already known to the player, so you won't be missing out on anything. Or maybe you've already beaten the game and you're going around finishing up side quests or doing everyone's favorite task, collectibles. The other side of the argument is that if you haven't beaten the game yet and you're choosing to fast travel to locations to get to where you need to go, then that says something about the game world that you're in. Someone could say that the player isn't intrigued by the world or that it lacks having the player wanting to explore and find points of interest or other side quests. Maybe the player is missing out on something that the developers intended for them to interact with, and now it's being bypassed because of convenience. Everyone is familiar with Skyrim. If you were to end up fast traveling a lot of the time, you would miss out on a lot of locations. Now, where I believe fast travel is harmful to the game is when you're bypassing enemies or obstacles so you can complete the quest or mission. Hear me out. I can give you a few examples of when I think it takes away from the experience. The first example is from a game called Arma 3. Now, in this mode within the game of Arma, I've been given the task of stealing or destroying an ammo truck. I would rather steal a truck because I want what's in it. I had to travel from my base to get here. I was left with two options. This particular area where the ammo truck is behind enemy lines. That means that there are roadblocks, patrols, and a shortened time for QRF, which just means a response team. Option 1, I could take the main roads and fight my way through roadblocks and clear out the enemies on my way in, which means that I will use up ammo and or meds, and I might even lose squad mates on the way in before getting to my objective. Option 2, I avoid any unnecessary fights because I don't want to put anything at risk unless it's absolutely necessary. So I can move through trees and I can stay off road to avoid roadblocks and any patrols. If I were to go with option 1, I could clear a path into the objective, grab the truck, and then once I'm inside the truck, I simply open my map and fast travel right back to my home base and I complete the mission. If I was to do this, I would bypass any QRF that's on the way. This means that any additional loot that I could have gathered, such as weapons, ammo, or vehicles, on the way out is now gone. Another potential outcome of option 1 is that I would have gotten into a fight, and on the way out, I ended up dead, which means that I failed to capture the ammo truck. Now, if I were to take option 2 and go the path of least resistance, once I was able to get in the truck, the outcome is still the same by fast traveling, except I'm now missing out on a lot more interaction. The enemies that I killed on the way into the objective in option 1, they're still alive if I was to take option 2. But now, I just completely bypass them on my way out. The thought of how do I get this ammo truck back to the base in one piece doesn't even cross my mind because in reality, I'm only playing half the mission. It's no longer a go there and bring this back. It's simply just a go there mission. There is no return journey. I think it's analogous to lifting weights. There are generally two types of people that work out. Person A will lift the weight up and then let gravity take the weight down. Person B will also lift the weight up, but on the way down, they will be slow, controlled, and they will let gravity guide them, but not let it take over. They are going for the complete experience. If you think about it, Person A is really only getting half of what Person B is getting just because Person B isn't skipping the return journey. If I were to fast travel back to my home base, I would be no different than Person A because who knows what might have happened on the return journey or the second half of the mission. In my opinion, if fast travel is to be used, I think it works best when you have to be at certain locations in order to do it. An example of this is how the Souls series handles fast travel. You have to be at a bonfire or a safe zone in order to be able to travel to other bonfires. The equivalent of this in other games would be to designate a hub or something similar given the game's context in order to be able to travel to a place of that player's choosing. Far Cry 2 uses this very same system. In order to fast travel, there were bus stations scattered around the map which allowed the player to interact with them and select another bus station to travel to. The Witcher 3 also uses this same system. The player has to interact with signposts and can only travel to other signposts scattered around the map. But here's the great part about this. It is entirely up to the player to make it as hard as they want. The player can choose how often fast travel is used, and if the game doesn't even have a built-in system, then the player can choose to only fast travel when they're inside a city or a town or whatever that the player chooses. Now, the third option to make games more difficult is a little bit more obscure. We have all these examples that we're about to talk about, but maybe we've never considered them. That being said, I think the third option is that we have to get creative. Now, hear me out. You may have to come up with a system if the game doesn't provide something that we're about to talk about. The first example is permadeath. Now, what is permadeath? Permadeath is a situation in which a character cannot reappear after having been killed. Permadeath can be extremely unforgiving and may even ruin a player's experience within a game. I do not suggest that everyone uses this method. Only the people that want a truly hardcore experience of a game will probably enjoy this. Now, what does permadeath do right? The first thing permadeath does right is that it makes every single encounter meaningful and impactful. Those bandits that aren't normally a threat could very well be the end of you. Every fight has the possibility of being your last and could end up sending you back to the main menu to make a new save slot. It may sound silly at first, but the fights that the player would normally consider to be mundane can now give the player a thrill that is unmatched like any other. If you're familiar with BRs, Battle Royales, or game modes that when you die and you won't respawn until the next round, then you probably can recall a time where you were under a lot of pressure. Your heart is thumping, and maybe your hands are shaking or sweating. Regardless if you won or lost, you still reacted to the game in that particular way. That thrill that you got was based on a single play session. You were invested, but nowhere near as invested as you would be after sinking a dozen hours into one save slot. The second thing that permadeath does right is that it will alter if and how the player approaches a fight. The player will have to be more strategic. The player can no longer afford to run at the objective or fight head on. That is a lot riskier, and if the player loses, well, that save slot's gone. If the player is exploring and comes across some enemies but knows killing them will only provide a small amount of XP, then the player may not want to even take the fight due to the risk of dying. The player will now be weighing the cost of every action that they take and whether or not it is even worth it. The third thing that permadeath does right is that it can make loot or things like crafting materials more important in the player's experience. I've caught myself in the very situation where I'll stock up on particular supply of weapons or materials in any game, and I'll tell myself that I'll eventually get around to using them, but I end up not using them at all. When permadeath is a thing, it can make the player use these hoarded materials more freely because you need every single advantage that you can get. Now, permadeath is definitely not perfect. It can cause problems if it's implemented in a video game depending on the context. Something permadeath doesn't do well is when there's accidental deaths or unjust deaths. For example, sometimes games can kill the player out of the blue, which is no fault of the player at all. We're not talking about not giving you a heads up about an enemy or something like a trap that you didn't see that you think is bogus. We're talking about falling through the map and the player dying, or something clips into the terrain and kills the player and it's clear that this isn't something that's natural. I've played my fair share of Ghost Recon Wildlands. In this game, there's a permadeath mode that is called Ghost Mode. I couldn't tell you how many times I died playing this mode with my dad trying to beat the game, but we eventually did. There were more than enough deaths that were deserved, and there were also more deaths than I could count on two hands where the game decided that I should be unjustly killed. The point is that certain games may or may not mesh well with this, and ultimately it's up to the player to decide and figure out if it's compatible for the game. One thing is certain though, permadeath will raise the stakes in every single encounter in a video game. Now, there is also varying degrees of permadeath, such as having the opportunity to recover the loot that the player lost if they're able to make it back to their body. Dark Souls does this to where you can recover your XP or souls as long as you don't die again, but if you do die before recovering your body, then it gets wiped from the world. Gray Zone Warfare does this exact thing as well. Some games allow the player to change the setting of what happens to their inventory after death. If the game does allow this, I would recommend playing with the settings and finding what suits what you want best. Extraction shooters are a branch of permadeath games because if you die, then everything that you brought into that raid with you will be lost. Granted, depending on the game and if there's safe pouches or if there's insurance on items. But this is why there is such a high in these games because of what is at stake. When you win, it feels like a big win. This also comes with the lows as well. It brings balance to the way the game works. Being creative and coming up with a way to increase difficulty in a particular game can sometimes even lead you to more of an extreme than permadeath. The second example is something called no hit. No hit is a challenge where the player completes a game from start to finish without taking any damage, staggers, or direct hits from enemies, bosses, or even traps. I personally don't see myself ever trying something like this, so I can't speak from direct experience, but my dad has played Ghost Recon Wildlands for years with and without me, like I said before. He has this thing that he does when he plays the game by himself, where if he gets shot, then he starts over with a brand new character. I know that sounds absolutely psycho, and you may be right, but here's the thing. It has heightened his experience of playing that game to levels I will never experience. When we went back and beat the game on Ghost Mode, on the hardest difficulty, I remember him saying that this was easy to him because he can get shot as long as he doesn't die. Now, for anyone that hasn't played this game, or maybe this game mode, let me tell you something. I have played a lot of games, and this game mode is not easy, or at least the way that we played it. Much like the previous things that we talked about earlier in this video, we played with no HUD, on the hardest difficulty, and with permadeath. My dad thought that doing all of those things wasn't as hard as it would normally be for him because of his no-hit solo experience. No-hit runs can be found on various other games, but typically not shooter games. Much like permadeath, it is up to the player on whether or not no-hit is implemented because it may or may not mesh well with the game. Another creative example of something that the player can do isn't rocket science or may not even seem exciting, but will give you a far better experience, is save scumming. Now, what is save scumming? Save scumming is the video game practice of frequently saving progress and reloading that same save file multiple times to reverse undesirable outcomes and ensure success in risky situations or avoid losing progress. Doing this will most definitely take the weight and impact out of decisions that the player makes. It's common in RPGs and strategy games, but not exclusive to those. For example, maybe you have the option of intimidating an NPC or using some alternative method to make the outcome more favorable to you. So before the player has the interaction, they save the game. Then they interact with the NPC and they end up failing to intimidate, which in turn causes the player to lose honor or maybe reputation with a certain faction. Maybe the player tries to pickpocket someone or something and gets caught. Now they have to figure out whether or not they want to pay a fine or maybe kill witnesses. These are the consequences to the player's actions. If the player was to reload the save just before the interaction that didn't go according to plan, half the story that was just told would be obsolete, and it would make the win not feel as special. You see, the thing is if the player has a 30% chance of completing something, but uses save scumming to achieve the outcome, then that isn't a 30% success rate, it's a 100% success rate. There is no risk at all, so it doesn't seem that special then. Another example of save scumming is that if the battle is fought and lost, the player loses territory or supplies or whatever. Well, that's inconvenient, so the player can just reload the save before the outpost was taken or the battle was fought and undo the failure of the player. Now, this doesn't mean that saves are a bad thing. I think that they are necessary. Without the ability to save games, that would mean that the player would have to beat the game in one playthrough, which is obviously absurd. Something that I wouldn't personally consider save scumming is when the player dies and it's considered game over, which then the player is prompted to load up a previous save like The Witcher 3 or Skyrim. I don't see a problem with saving before you go in to fight a boss. The problem starts when the game will allow the player to fail, but the player saves so that they never do. This is where I see the problem and believe that it will hinder the experience of whatever game the player is in. It may be corny, but failing is a big part of life. It always has been and always will be. It's one of those things that keep you humble. We need failure in our lives because it makes success that much more special. Failure is a teacher. You just have to be willing to listen. All in all, if you're looking to make a game that you played countless times have more weight, or you want your actions to mean more, then these things may be something that you can implement into a playthrough to make a game more difficult and give you an experience that is truly on another level. I have a long list of games that I need to play. I'm excited to be able to slowly chip away at that list, and I have ideas with a lot of them on how I can get an amazing experience from them. Hopefully, I've said some things that will, at the very least, get you to think. If you stuck around to this part of the video, I just want to say thank you very much. It means a lot to me that you sat here and listened to me ramble. If you have any ideas on how to improve the experience or plan on playing a game with something that we talked about, then let me know down below in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys and talk about it. But until next time, I'm Twinkle Toes. Thanks for sticking around and hope to see you in the next one.